Following the starting of the Bakelys, the U.S. began another new class of destroyers. These were the 1,637-ton Benham class. These ships were basically repeats of the Gridleys, except they had 3 as opposed to 4 of the Gridleys' more powerful engines. This meant they weren't as fast as the Gridleys, but were still as fast as other destroyers that had 4 of the relatively lower pressure boilers. Being larger also meant that unlike the Gridleys, they were more stable, less stressed, and could accept realistic wartime modifications. All 10 were started between March 17, 1936 and September 22, 1937. They entered service between August 5, 1938 and November 20, 1939. Main armament was 4 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, 2 forward in single enclosed turrets, and 2 aft in single open mounts. Torpedo armament remained 16 21-inch torpedo tubes in 4 quadruple midship mounts, 2 on either side. 2 depth charge racks at the tail rounded out their original main armament. Power was provided by 3 boilers venting to 1 funnel that generated 50,000 horsepower to 2 shafts. This gave them a top speed of 37 knots. Starting in 1942, these ships, like most destroyers, began a progressive series of upgrades that increased their effectiveness. The number 4 5-inch gun was given an enclosed turret, while the number 3 5-inch was given front and side walls with a canvas top. Also, the rear pair of torpedo tubes were removed in favor of more depth charges and a pedestal mount for anti-aircraft guns. Late in the war, Sturret and Lang replaced their remaining torpedo tubes and rear gun shields with even more light and medium anti-aircraft guns. Needless to say, radar was constantly upgraded throughout the war. On December 7, 1941, the normal light and medium anti-aircraft guns on virtually all U.S. ships was the 50 caliber or 12.7 mm for light anti-aircraft and the 1.1 inch or 28 mm for medium anti-aircraft. After overcoming the initial problems inherent with most new systems, they were both mechanically good. In fact, the 50 caliber is still used today, albeit against soft targets, like speedboats and such. Unfortunately, the reality was that by World War II, these weapons just didn't have the range or hitting power to effectively engage the then new generation of fast and mostly or all metal mono-wing planes. As a result, starting in 1942, the U.S. began switching to the more powerful 20mm or Lincoln and 40mm Bofors for light and medium anti-aircraft respectively. Not only did these guns use heavier shells, but they also had a higher sustained rate of fire than their predecessors. Eventually, they would be found on virtually every ship of every type, with numbers varying from ship to ship even within a class. The Bofors especially proved devastating, as its weight meant that unlike the freestanding 20mm, it usually had to be fitted in a power-operated mount. More on that later. Near the end of the war, despite their impressive proven record, even these guns would be considered inadequate against the kamikaze. Stopping a plane that wants to fly over you is one thing, stopping a plane trying to deliberately fly into you is another. So, as the war was winding down, and post-war, the number of 20mm diminished and the 40mm were slowly replaced with 3-inch 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns that could not only be radar guided, but also fired a heavier proximity fused shell. For many years, it was realized that it wasn't necessary to actually hit a plane to shoot it down. In fact, it was actually harder that way. Instead, it's easier to have a shell explode near the aircraft and shower it with fragments, kind of like hitting someone with a hand grenade rather than a bullet. The problem was always finding a way to get the shell to explode near the plane. The most common way was to have the shell manually set to explode after a given number of seconds of being fired. Of course, this was pretty haphazard, as it meant the gunners had to quickly guess where the plane would be when the flying shell intersected its course. A better option came with the introduction of the VT, or proximity, or fuzzy fuse. This was a shell, usually 3 or 5 inches, that had a small radar built into its nose. Now the shell itself could tell when it was near a plane and should explode. This proved especially effective against Japanese planes which sacrificed virtually all armor for increased speed, range, and maneuverability. Myrant, Trippe, Rhind, and Rowan spent virtually the entire war in the Atlantic, mostly together. first escorting convoys, notably the disastrous PQ-17, then taking part in the North Africa landing. In mid-1943, they covered first the Sicilian landing and then the invasion of Italy. On July 26, 1943, off Salerno, a near miss on Myron acted like a torpedo hit, flooding her engine room. She had to be towed to safety, but was repaired and returned to service. Rowan wasn't as lucky. On September 10, 1943, as she was escorting an empty convoy, she was attacked by German E-boats. Hit by at least one torpedo, she quickly sank with heavy loss of life. The remaining 3 ships returned to convoy escort and training, transferring to the Pacific following Germany's surrender. Benham and Ellet were escorting the carrier Enterprise when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Both protected Enterprise during the Doolittle raid, then at the Battle of Midway. In early July 1942, Lang, Stack, Sturrett, and Wilson transferred from the Atlantic to the Pacific with the carrier Wasp. Benham covered the initial Guadalcanal landings, then protected Enterprise at the Battle of Eastern Solomons. Early in the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, she was hit by a torpedo that blew her bow off. The next day, with repairs unfeasible, the crew abandoned ship and she was scuttled. Ellet covered the initial Guadalcanal landings, then protected Enterprise at the Battle of Eastern Solomons. She spent the rest of the war escorting carriers, providing fire support, and protecting convoys. Lang escorted Wasp during her 2 Spitfire deliveries to Malta in early 1942. In June 1942, she transferred to the Pacific with Wasp, where she joined the fighting in the Solomons. Taking part in the Battle of Vella Gulf, she spent the rest of the war escorting carriers, providing fire support, and protecting convoys. Stack was escorting Wasp in the Atlantic on March 17, 1942, when the two collided. Repairs would keep her out of the war until late May 1942. Returning to service in early June 1942, she escorted Wasp to the Pacific and took part in the initial invasion of Guadalcanal. She spent the rest of the year escorting convoys in the Southwest Pacific. In early August 1943, she took part in the Battle of Vella Gulf. She spent the rest of the war escorting carriers, providing fire support, and protecting convoys. Sturrett escorted Wasp during her 2nd Spitfire delivery to Malta in early 1942. In June 1942, she transferred to the Pacific with Wasp, where she joined the fighting in the Solomons. At the overnight 1st Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, she had her steering gear, aft 5-inch gun, and torpedo tubes damaged. Repairs would keep her out of the war until February 1943. Returning to action, she also took part in the Battle of Vella Gulf. She escorted carriers, provided fire support, and protected convoys until April 1945. Off Okinawa on April 9, 1945, she was hit by a kamikaze near the waterline. All electrical power, including power to her guns and communications, was knocked out. Her steering gear was also knocked out, as was her forward fuel tanks. Repairs lasted the rest of the war. Wilson escorted Wasp during her Spitfire deliveries to Malta. In June 1942, she transferred to the Pacific with Wasp, where she joined the invasion of Guadalcanal, taking part in the Battle of Savo Island. Returning from refit in January 1943, she escorted carriers, provided fire support, and protected convoys until the end of the war. Off Okinawa on April 16, 1945, she was hit by a kamikaze that lightly damaged her. Post-war, the 8 survivors were decommissioned. Ellet, Lang, and Sturrett were scrapped, and the others were used as targets at the Bikini bomb test.